Welcome to Learning from Caregivers, an interview series where we'll be digging into the latest information from both on-the-ground caregivers as well as caregiving scientists to help people support the needs of older adults, their families, and communities. This podcast is for health professionals and for all of us who care for older adults. My name is Joan Monin, and I'm a professor at Yale School of Public Health. And today we're going to be talking about hormones and Alzheimer's disease. And I'm so happy to have with me today Dr. Phil Sarrel, and back again with us, Dr. Carolyn Fredericks. Dr. Sarrel is Professor Emeritus of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences, as well as a Professor of Psychiatry. He's the founder of the Yale Menopause program and the Yale Sex Counseling Service. His research interests have included the effects of transdermal estrogen in postmenopausal women with symptomatic atherosclerotic coronary vascular disease, nutrients and endothelial function, ovarian hormones and menstrual cycle-related migraines, postmenopausal sexual function, and numerous other topics. He's the author or co-author of more than 100 journal articles, 50 book chapters, and 6 books, as well as more than 50 abstracts. Dr. Fredericks is an assistant professor in neurology. Her research focuses on preclinical Alzheimer's disease and on less common Alzheimer's variants, using advanced imaging tools to better understand how Alzheimer's disease progresses through functional networks in the brain. Dr. Fredericks also sees patients with a variety of cognitive and behavioral concerns, and she specializes in the diagnosis and treatment of neurodegenerative disorders. So welcome, Phil and Carolyn. Thanks so much for coming and sharing the latest science on hormones and Alzheimer's disease. So Phil, I'm going to start with asking you some questions, and here's a basic one to start with. How does estrogen affect the brain?
Well, this is a very exciting time because there's so much new research demonstrating the effects of estrogen in the brain that I can't wait to share it with a larger audience. The bottom line, of course, is that estrogen, whether it's taken as a prescription or made within the body, circulates in the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier. So that's the first question. Does it get into the brain? And the answer is yes, indeed. It does get into the brain. But there's something else that many people don't know, and that is that neurons in the brain, throughout the brain, make neurosteroids. And among them, the most prominent is estradiol. So neurons throughout the brain are making the most important of the estrogens all the time, both in men and in women. That discovery, by the way, was made by one of our retired professors, Dr. Fred Naftalin, in 1971 when he was working at Oxford and published that the brain makes neurosteroids. So it's not just ovaries, or it's not just taking a pill or a patch. And there must be a reason why the brain is making estrogen. It is making it because neurons have what are called estrogen receptors on the membrane of the cell and in the nucleus of the cell. And estrogen, through that receptor mechanism, induces literally thousands of actions within the cells. We now have the technology actually to figure out, for example, in a breast cancer cell, it produces an average of 3,500 different actions, more than half of which is to kill the breast cancer cell. Many people don't know that estrogen can kill a breast cancer cell, but it does regularly. In the brain, it has many actions through the receptors, but it also has actions outside of the brain that affect the brain. So, for example, it affects how much epinephrine and norepinephrine is free in the bloodstream. The control of catecholamines is very important in helping the brain to function normally. Estradiol plays a major role in controlling catecholamines. It also induces the production of a very important substance called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide keeps arteries open. and nitric oxide works directly within the brain. Estradiol, made from arginine, induces the production of nitric oxide. So that's very important. And then a third is, as many people don't know, that estradiol, is a calcium channel blocking agent that turns out to be very important in neurology, because we learned that women who have a problem of severe dystonia related to their menstrual cycle have an estrogen deficiency problem, and they're getting too much calcium in their muscle. So there are all sorts of fascinating things that correlate. Another thing to keep in mind about estrogen acting in the brain is it induces blood flow to the brain. So here at Yale for almost 9 years, we studied middle cerebral artery and how, with ultrasound, how blood flow through that vessel was affected by the estrogen level. So it's having actions through receptors, actions through catecholamines, nitric oxide, calcium, and overall maintaining blood flow to the brain. Lots of stuff to think about.
So I think you already kind of got a little into this, but what are some of the brain's actions affected by estradiol?
Well, a lot. And there's a wonderful paper written just 2 years ago in the journal called Aging Neuroscience, in which estradiol is referred to as the master regulator of the brain. The actions that we see are the normal actions are seen when there's estradiol deficiency. And so they include temperature control. They include sleep cycle, regulating the sleep cycle. Stress response, very important. Stress response and the role of estrogen in that. We'll see that in a moment in the octopus. Cognitive function, including memory. Mood disorders. Libido, how much more do you need? One more, because from a psychiatry point of view, it's very important. And that has to do with actions in the peripheral nervous system with respect to sensory perception. So there's a list of brain actions, bing, 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 one after another, all affected by the estrogen level. And when the estrogen level is depleted, all of these actions in the brain become disrupted. Essentially, the story is a story of interaction between the circulatory system and the nervous system. There's an exquisite relationship between the two systems. And that relationship was established millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. But we can say more about that as we go on.
Okay. So what are some of the estradiol cellular actions that are specifically related to cognitive function and development of dementia?
Well, the bottom line is estradiol protects neurons. That is the one takeaway message. How does it do that? Well, first of all, here's a list. It induces neuronal cell growth. It induces replication. It induces plasticity, which is extremely important in the brain's being able to adjust to changes in the environment. That's just the beginning. Apoptosis of neurons is a regular phenomenon, but it can get out of control. And if it does get out of control, you can actually see gray matter shrink, white matter shrink. All of that is affected by the estrogen level. Estrogen inhibits apoptosis, the death of neurons. See how it's protecting the cells. Well, let's go on. It supports immune response. So it plays a role in inhibiting inflammation, in inhibiting infection within the brain. With estradiol decline, and this has been shown by a number of studies, white matter and gray matter shrinks. Where? Here's a list of areas, of affected areas in the brain. The prefrontal cortex, temporal and parietal regions, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, basal forebrain, all have been demonstrated to be affected directly by estrogen support and reacting to estrogen depletion. There's a wonderful study from the group in Pittsburgh. It's called the SWAN study. It's women's health across the nation, the study of women's health across the nation. And Dr. Thurston, I'm forgetting her first name, is Rebecca Thurston. Yeah, I started to say Rebecca. What she did was study brain activity during a hot flash. And what she showed was there's a phenomenon called a white hyperintensity that develops during the hot flash, and that is destructive of cells. How is it destructive? Well, what has been documented by Thurston and by Brinton in working in
Actually, when you
Arizona
talk about
now,
the vasodilatory effects of estrogen, it makes me want to go a little off script and ask you about your thoughts about.
And amyloid is deposited. See, now we're getting closer to the story with dementia, because this drop in glucose and this increase in amyloid is not good for the brain. And that sets the platform, that sets the stage for subsequent development of really deranged function and dementia. Now, let's see, did I cover it all? I think I left out one that a lot of people don't know about. Remember, I mentioned that estrogen induces nitric oxide. It controls the release of nitric oxide. When the estrogen drops, it gets out of control. And interestingly, the brain accumulates an excess of nitric oxide. And it forms a compound. It actually becomes sulfonated. So it's called SNO, sulfonated nitric oxide. What that does is it stimulates microglia in the brain to go and eat up synapses. It destroys neuronal synapses. That was work done by the group, both a collaborative study from MIT and the Scripps Institute in California. So that is something else. That's enough list to try to think about. You see, but it does go on, and I had to stop somewhere because we have to give you time to talk. So
it's just exciting that so much information is coming out about this right now.
Well, a lot of it is technological advance. Mm-hmm. When I first started wanted to study the brain and the reaction, we had a little marker an isotope that we could measure brain blood flow with. We did this 30 years ago. And we said, oh, look, there's a difference. But we couldn't say much more 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, look at how you can pinpoint it.
Yeah.
The role of the lymphatic system in waste product removal in the brain and whether estrogen might be mediating some of that.
Well, see, I've been studying estrogen for 60 years. And I don't know the answer to your question.
I don't know that anybody does.
Because there's just too much to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe there is no literature on it. The very first time I worked with estrogen was in 1960 as a medical student studying breast cancer cells. And in that study, estrogen killed the breast cancer cells. Mm-hmm. Progesterone made them grow. That was the interesting finding. But I've been so fascinated by this molecule. I literally have been trying to learn as much as I can. I learn something new every week. It never ends. It's wonderful to have something like that.
It is.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, does loss of estradiol production at menopause influence cognitive function and the development of dementia?
Okay. So 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting at the FDA. And one of the speakers was a woman named Professor Roberta Brinton. And she presented the data on estrogen deficiency and the development of neurodegenerative diseases. And what has been found is not just Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a major increase in women who have become estrogen deficient and the estrogen hasn't been replaced. These would be young women who've had a hysterectomy, their ovaries taken out, the estrogen was not replaced. Bingo, they've got a big problem with Parkinson's developing. That was first shown by the group at the Mayo Clinic. That's Dr. Rocco, who is a neurologist. And he's been with that group since 1988. So we have long-term studies. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and multiple sclerosis, all increased in women who have been made estrogen deficient. So that's one part of the answer to your question. we did a study at Yale looking at cognitive decline. And what I'd like to show is a slide of that. So we were interested here. So what we did first was we put together a multidisciplinary team, which included everywhere from dermatology and neurology to gynecology and psychiatry. We had 12 different people. We originally had a list of over 200 symptoms that everyone suggested. We narrowed it down, and we found 52 symptoms that seemed to be symptoms that developed at menopause, that were affecting women's ability to function, and did respond to estrogen replacement. So what you see, and what we also had was a special interest in this was because of Dr. Missouri, a special interest in symptoms affecting work. But look at what the symptoms are and think about the brain. Sleep disturbance, hot flashes, anxiety attacks, depression, memory. You see how the brain is there in every single one of these things. But now let's look at the next slide. What we found was there were more subtle symptoms affecting the women's ability to work. Trouble remembering, disturbed sleep, worrying too much, difficulty making decisions, checking and double checking, temper outbursts, blocked in getting things done. And the last one, which women emphasized, they said it should say doing tasks very slowly to ensure correctness. Those were all affecting women in their ability to work. And look at how high the percentages are at baseline. 82% trouble remembering, 80% with disturbed sleep, 74% with worrying too much. Then the women were put in a double-blind, randomized control where half got estradiol, half got placebo. And what happened at the end of 6 months? Look at the difference. The difference is profound. Trouble remembering goes from 82% to 26%. Disturbed sleep from 80 to 10%. Look at angry temper outbursts, 34 to 6%. One of the women was a waitress, and she was constantly breaking dishes in the restaurant. She stopped breaking dishes. She was sent to us by the owner of the restaurant because he said, she is such a good waitress, I don't want to lose her. We said, we'll do our best. She didn't quit. Another one of the women in this study was the president of a bank, and she was about to quit because she couldn't remember the names of the people on her board of directors. She also stayed with the study. By the end of 6 months, stayed on as president. She could remember everything by that time. So there are changes in memory, but as will be shown in some of these long-term cohort studies, in a fair percentage of the women, the changes that are occurring when they're having hot flashes and early on in the story can get better. So why that happens and why other women don't get better, that's still a nice question to try to figure out. But so here's changes in mental function affecting a very important thing. I mean, half the workforce is women. So you're looking at such an important issue. And women do stop working prematurely because of menopause. There's a study from England that 20% of the doctors in the National Health Service, of the women doctors, quit because of menopause symptoms. Wow. And it's stuff like this.
Wow, you really don't hear about that at all.
No.
You often think like that's the time, that's the peak of your career, right?
That's right. That's right. And they quit. And further in that data, and it's a large number of women, half of them could not find a doctor who knew anything about menopause to help them. That's really the crisis we have of the doctors aren't trained. And it's not difficult to be trained. We've dedicated the last 10 years to training healthcare providers in how to deliver menopause healthcare. But still, there's a small number.
I hear from some of my friends mixed information from doctors.
Right, they get poor information. They're not informed. We do have a program, and in 2024, there were 68 healthcare providers at Yale who did the program. It's called menopauselearning.com. And we had 68 here, and then we had 100 and some odd from the Cleveland Clinic and more we had 5 major centers, Northwestern, Cleveland Clinic, University of Miami. Altogether, 424 doctors, nurses took the 6-month program and did it. So we're making inroads, and the interest is growing. So the number of providers who are ready to do the right job is, in fact, growing. But it takes time. So in answer to your question, the midlife, because your question was about, does it influence cognitive function? Mm-hmm. There's a beautiful example of influence on cognitive function. The Mayo Clinic studies show a really profound difference, with 60% of the women having major problems with cognitive function after losing their ovaries at a young age. And that's going to be one of our final points, is that the most vulnerable women are women who are having a hysterectomy, or a hysterectomy with removal of their ovaries. Even if the ovaries are left behind, they stop functioning. I wrote a paper in 1986 on how ovaries stop functioning after hysterectomy. It takes 7 years, and they're all non-functional. If the average age, half of all hysterectomies, the women are under age 45. Half of all the hysterectomies. By age 50, 1 out of 3 women in the United States have had a hysterectomy. So we're talking about very large numbers of women. In the past, 95% would have been given estrogen replacement. But in the present, because of unwarranted fears of estrogen, we can talk about that, but that's getting off topic. But in the present, the figure instead of 95% is less than 20%. In the WHI study, the Women's Health Initiative, it's 4% of the women with no uterus who would benefit the most are using estrogen. That's terrible. Mm.
So can you describe some of the clinical studies of estrogen therapy and its impact on cognitive function and progression of dementia?
Okay, so we're on that, and we talked about Brinton's work, and we talked about neurodegenerative diseases. We talked about the Yale study. There's also a Yale trial, a 9-year study funded by the NIH. It's called the WEST study, Women's Estrogen for Stroke Prevention Trial. All 652 women in that study had had a stroke. Half were put on estradiol, half were put on placebo. One of the important findings in the study, and this would be an important takeaway, is that now the average age of the women in the WEST study was 71 years old. The oldest woman we randomized was 91 years old, and she finished the study 4 years later. But what we did find that was really important from a cognitive function point of view, there are women, a large group of women in the study, who had normal cognitive function at the beginning, at baseline. They were tested every 6 months, 5 times, over a 2.5-year period. And those now all the women in the study over a 4-year period showed decline in cognitive function. Remember, the 91-year-old, I'm sure she showed some decline. I can definitely relate to that. But what's fascinating is the rate of decline, because this can make a very big difference. And in the women who at age 75 or 71 or 78 or 82 who had normal cognitive function, those who received estrogen have a significant difference, positive difference in the rate of decline of cognitive function. That's very important. So it's never too late. And it is interesting that a study from the NIH and the Medicare group 2 years ago, well, no, it's only a little over a year ago, showed women over age 65. This is supposed to be a no-no. You stop estrogen by? No. Their study is of 11 million Medicare women, 1,200,000 of whom used estrogen after the age of 65 and showed a significant difference in the development of dementia. That's relevant to what we're talking about. There's one other study that's important, and that's the KEEPS study. That was also an estrogen placebo-controlled study, and that showed that women who had the APOE E3 or E4 gene, they showed a positive response to the estrogen with respect to glucose metabolism and amyloid. So here was your highest risk women, and they indeed show a significant difference if they were given the estrogen. So there, you see, it's not a lack of studies. Mm-hmm. It's a lack of knowledge of the studies and what's already been shown. So does that answer your question? You're not going to have any time. We got to stop.
Yeah, that's okay. Is there any other takeaway messages that, you would want to share with people about this topic?
Remember, I mentioned that estrogen plays a major role in brain blood flow. Here's what happens. When a woman has a hot flash, blood shifts in the body. The skin vasodilates, and 20% of all the blood volume in your body goes to the skin. Where does it come from? The brain is one of the places it comes from. So here's an example where this researcher is showing that during a hot flush, you see all those areas that are reddened. This is how much blood flow there is a significant drop in brain blood flow during the hot flush. So you see phenomena like white hyperintensities and these destruction that it can cause, and you see the sulfonation that occurs. Here's another demonstration. With estrogen, the same person doesn't show that. The brain blood flow is protected. So that's getting really not to the heart of the matter, but the brain of the matter. My first slide is an octopus. And why do I show an octopus? The octopus has been around for 600 million years. It's a magnificent example of brain and hearts working together. The octopus has 9 brains. It has a brain for each tentacle and a brain for the top. It also has 3 hearts. It doesn't have bone to worry about. It doesn't have all the glands. It does all the endocrine work through its eyes. It's an amazing creature. How amazing? Well, in one of the studies cited here, it is so smart, it will recognize your face. It's even smarter than that. At the ends of its tentacles, it has receptors can actually identify individual molecules. And one of the molecules that it will identify and take into its body is estradiol 17 beta. So 600 million years ago, this animal learned how to survive. And it learned how to survive by using the very first steroid ever formed. Estradiol is the very first steroid that ever formed in the course of evolution, and it took it into its body, put it to work, making nitric oxide, controlling catecholamines, blocking calcium, and surviving. One of the most fascinating aspects of its survival, what does an octopus do when it sees danger? It changes its skin color. How does it do that? Well, it turns out that pigment in your skin is controlled by estrogen. That was another Yale professor in the dermatology department 60 years ago who showed melanocytes are estrogen receptor positive, and when you get to menopause, you can't tan anymore. You burn. What an octopus does with its estrogen is it changes its skin color and disappears. So the whole idea of, remember that on my list of brain activities was stress response. It has a magnificent stress response. It made it work for 600 million years. And we have a carryover of that in our melanocytes. So that's enough. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Wow. I could talk to you forever. Learn so much.
Well, it's a great topic to talk about.
Yeah. And it's just so relevant to what I'm going through.
The bottom line of what we're talking about is the role of estrogen in biological existence. And it's been there for 600 million years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Well, Carolyn, I really wanted to bring you into this conversation because, you're an expert on sex differences and Alzheimer's disease. So I had a few questions that I think go well with this, which is, and I think the first one might be, how do amyloid and tau buildup differ between men and women with Alzheimer's disease?
Well, first of all, I think that we've laid such an interesting context and groundwork for the Alzheimer's side of all this with our conversation to date. And I wish we could sort of recapture some of the octuple adaptations for our own use. But in terms of amyloid and tau, it's very interesting. So the single biggest risk factor for the development of amyloid is age. And as far as we are able to appreciate now, there aren't so many sex differences in terms of age or cognitive stage at which men and women develop appreciable levels of amyloid. Tau is where the story really changes, though. It seems that for women and men with a similar level of elevated amyloid, the tau propagation that induces in women is significantly more aggressive. And we don't fully understand the reasons for that. We do know, for example, though, that women who've had an early hysterectomy or hysterectomy and oophorectomy are much more likely to see an even more aggressive trajectory of tau buildup across the Brock stages in the brain.
And so your lab has shown some changes in functional connectivity that occur in women around the time of menopause. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah, and especially in the context of Alzheimer's disease.
I'd love to. I mean, this is work that we didn't really intend to get into, but during the pandemic, when we weren't able to collect our new data, which is right after I'd arrived here at Yale, we started looking at public data sets, and one that had recently become available was the Human Connectome Project's aging cohort, which is a very large study of men and women aged 35 to 100, and they really do have a bunch of 90-somethings in there. So this enormous data set of healthy, as far as we know, human aging. And my first research assistant, Bronte Fitzik-Tanny, and I at that time started looking at differences between the functional connectome, so how different parts of the brain are connected to each other, and men and women over that very long trajectory of brain aging. And at first, we started to model age just in a linear fashion. So as women and men get older, what's changing more in women or less in women compared to men? But then we started to realize that a lot of the findings we were noticing, specifically that this important network for memory function called the default mode network, was more tightly interconnected in the back parts of that network in women than in men. We realized when we analyzed by decade that this effect was really driven by women in their 40s and 50s, and especially in their 40s. And of course, these are the decades that for most women surround the menopausal transition. And so we got very interested in what was going on in the brain that would cause this phenotype to emerge. We were especially interested because this kind of relative increased connectivity in the back part of the default mode network is something that we usually associate with vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease. It's a pattern that we see in people with preclinical disease, with very early clinical stages of the disease. And so it seemed that it might relate to women's increased vulnerability to Alzheimer's. We know, again, that women have more aggressive trajectories of disease when they get Alzheimer's disease, that two-thirds of Alzheimer's patients, rather, are women, and that's not entirely accounted for by longevity, that genotypes like ApoE4 are more influential in terms of their increased Alzheimer's risk in women than in men. And we wondered if some of this could be related. An interesting piece of this, though, was that this increased connectivity in this network actually correlated well with memory performance. So this was something that may be adaptive for women over the course of the lifetime. Women typically perform better on tests of memory, verbal memory, than men do, including in the middle decades. And so it may be that this is a connectivity pattern that's adaptive initially, but that then comes to create or relate to increased vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease. And so what we're focusing on in the lab right now, and we're excited to have kind of a new grant that will let us do this, is to understand the relationship between these connectivity changes, the movement of that Alzheimer's protein tau in the brain, and how those things are related to the kinds of factors that we've been discussing earlier this hour. So things like the timing of menopause, especially in cases where menopause is brought upon early by surgical intervention, the timing of the overall reproductive periods, the overall estrogen exposure that women have, other sex hormones that vary, especially during the menopausal transition. So my graduate student, Jordan, who joined us last time, is very interested in FSH as well, which is another sex hormone that rises extensively over the course of the menopausal transition. And that she's finding seems to relate to both that connectivity pattern and to cognitive changes over the course of menopause. So we're relatively much newer to this field, but I think we're hoping to draw some bridges between all of the work that's already been done in establishing the actions of estrogen in the brain that are protective and in establishing what happens when that estrogen is withdrawn and integrating those with more recent findings of how tau is propagating more aggressively in women and why.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this another time, but the role of technology and making some of this more possible, like for the work that you're doing now, and how that's changed over time. Are there any kind of new innovations that allow you to kind of look at this a little bit more beyond the 1990s or the 1980s?
Yeah, this is a field that's evolving so quickly in so many ways. And I think two of the things that we're excited to take advantage of in this new grant are, one is the availability of good plasma biomarkers for Alzheimer's risk. So this has been in the news quite a bit in the last few months because the FDA recently approved the Fujirebio assays for amyloid and tau, essentially specific ratios of amyloid isoforms and specific phosphorylated tau forms that predict people's Alzheimer's risk with great sensitivity and specificity. And those are, I think, likely to become commercially available soon. But in the meantime, on a research basis, we can use these blood tests to look at the relationship between those blood biomarkers and what we're seeing on MRI and PET imaging, and to better understand how women's risk evolves over time. We're also really excited that Yale has a new PET scanner called the NX, which is short for NeuroExplorer, that has just unprecedentedly fine resolution. So we'll be able to look at tau binding. So we'll be using a ligand that binds to abnormal Alzheimer's tau in the brain, and we'll be able to see how that binding is increasing in very, very small structures. So
yeah, and it's such a tremendous opportunity to invest in science, as we're making these breakthroughs, and for our society to really kind of think about how these new biomarkers are not only just for us to just take them as citizens, but actually can lead to the innovations in the work that you're doing by having that sensitivity to those markers.
And, both with this study and with all the work that we've been talking about, it's the interplay of clinical trials and the patient's experience that kind of drives everything forward. I was just thinking about how when I started medical school in 2005, we were right in that first backlash where everyone was coming off their hormone replacement therapy after the 2002 WHI study had emerged. And I think it's very careful research that's allowed us to kind of move the pendulum back to a more neutral place. And that's so important to have that ongoing stream of research that's constantly questioning.
Yeah, it's another one of those lessons about how in science we're just continuing to learn new things. It doesn't mean that, someone's trying to pull the wool over your eyes or something like that, the more and more we do studies, we're able to interrogate some of those earlier studies and kind of build off them and get more evidence and, get closer and closer to what is actually going to help everyone.
Right.
Carolyn, there are a lot of lessons to learn from what happened in the WHI story, because for those who don't know, in 2002, the Women's Health Initiative published a paper. It was in July of that year, with a great deal of press coverage and so on, declaring that hormone therapy would increase the risk for breast cancer, although that wasn't true at the time. And they subsequently showed that it was not true at all. But blood clotting, all sorts of no protection of the heart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was of a particular arm in the Women's Health Initiative, and those were women who were getting estrogen, but also a very potent anti-estrogen so the drug was called Prempro. And what we know, remember I mentioned that in 1960 I was a medical student studying breast cancer cells. There were 4 arms in that breast cancer study. One was estrogen, which actually was the one that killed the breast cancer cells. Then there was one that made them grow. And that was the one that used medroxyprogesterone acetate. It had only been discovered in 1957. But by 62, we were able to say, this drug causes breast cancer cells to grow. Well, it will even turn out in the subsequent years, because WHI has published now over something like 1,200 papers. And each time they take us a little further into the study and they tell us, no, there is no increase in risks with the estrogen. In fact, there's a decrease in death from dementia in the women who took estrogen in the women's health. That's right on our topic. But there's also major decreases in all-cause mortality, just as the other studies, the cohort studies, they somewhat corroborate each other. But the lesson we learn is that once people are shocked, there's an economist who writes about zombie thinking. And once people get into a fear of something, it's very difficult from a psychiatry point of view. People will carry deep fears when there's no need to do that. But boy, let me tell you, in therapy, it's very difficult to overcome those fears. So the fear of hormone therapy persists unnecessarily because, as we saw at the FDA just 2 weeks ago, Joan Manson, who's the main spokesperson for the Women's Health Initiative, her presentation was, well, there are no increased risks with estrogen. What we've seen is a decreased risk in hip fractures and heart attacks and dementia. It goes on and on and on. So, and in the study of women using estrogen after age 65, those women, they show a decrease in the risk of lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, and ovarian cancer, just because they used estrogen. Everyone needs to know that, because that's over 1 million women in that study.
They do, yeah.
So, but the fear is still there, and it had a major impact on research, because, I mean, people had grants who were studying, in a career path, on estrogen actions, including in neurology, on blood flow to the brain. We have one paper about that, but then it all came to a halt because everyone became afraid of using hormone therapy. We have a paper from Yale, which is about, in 2011, they published a paper that the women who took estrogen who were age 50 to 59 had a decreased risk of dying of a heart attack. And we took that data. It's published in the American Journal of Public Health. And we showed, guess what, folks? In the 10 years of this misinformation, 50,000 women have died in their 50s and 60s who never should have died. Wow. All because of misunderstanding. So we need to do whatever we can to correct that. Yeah. The FDA is going to do, I think, something to correct that.
Well, we need to partner with psychologists and health messaging and maybe get some plush octopus toys out there to make people feel comfortable about getting estrogen therapy again. But this has been tremendously interesting and helpful to me personally, but I think to all the people who are going to watch this. And I thank you so much for your work and your work on this topic and your continued work to get this information out to people. And I'm excited to see what's going to happen next. So thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to meet with both of you.
Likewise. Thanks for having us.
Keep going.